All right, before we dive into this episode, the Minimalists want to help you declutter your glowing screen. So head on over to theminimalists.com/wallpapers to download any of our free minimalist wallpapers, including our Love People, Use Things wallpaper for your smartphone or computer. Enjoy. Chris in Tallahassee has a question.
Hello, guys. This is Chris from Florida. The question is about writing. I'm a technical writer by trade. It's my day job, but I write fiction in my spare time. Often I get an idea about a story that I'm excited about, and I'll start writing, but soon a newer, sexier idea comes along, and I feel tempted to abandon the first idea. Do you guys have some tips for staying energized with an older idea and finishing it before moving on to the next thing?
So I think what you are dealing with is what Stephen Pressfield would call the resistance,
the
sort of trademark resistance. You're starting a project, you're doing the easy parts, and it's not that you're having another idea and then you can't stay focused. It's that the beginning of the idea is usually the easiest, most fun part, and so you're like water. You're just going downhill towards, and then as soon as it gets hard, you're switching directions. So I would strongly suggest reading The War of Art. I think it's sort of the most important, creative sort of manifesto of our times. It's helped me on all sorts of projects. But what I would do is the next time you have an idea, don't just sit down and write the idea. I would sit down and plan out the idea. So you're like, okay, I would spend more time researching and outlining and investing in the idea so that your writing is not dependent on enthusiasm or excitement. Inspiration is not what gets you through the dip of a book.
No.
It has to be a purpose or a plan, or a very clear sense of what the outcome is, even if that's like, I know what the last sentence of this book is.
Yeah, there's the fiction writer Harlan Coben. He talks about how he knows where the book begins and ends. It's kind of like a map. If you know you're going to drive from New Jersey to San Diego, he knows the beginning and the end, and then he gets to find the most circuitous route to sort of get there, and that's the adventure for him. But he has a destination in mind. I will say this: when I think about writing, and maybe you can shed some light on this, Ryan. There are times where it does make sense to bail on a project.
Of course.
I think of the second book. I started out writing fiction. That was the thing that I did. The second novel I ever tried to write was a book called Just Past Central, and it eventually died on the vine, possibly because the main character dies in the first sentence of the book, and so like trying to figure out how I protracted it from there was really difficult. And I spent the better part of a year, going through different iterations, and eventually it didn't go anywhere, and I had to be willing to let go. But it wasn't because I'm not excited about this anymore. It wasn't a book. I thought it was, and it ended up not being that. I'm sure you've had projects that you've worked on where they didn't end up coming to fruition.
Yeah, another book recommendation, Seth Godin's The Dip, because that's what you eventually hit that point, and you got to know, do you keep going and you're actually just digging deeper and deeper, or are you about to come out the other side?
Right.
For me, like one of the things I do on my books is I break them up in smaller pieces. So like Stillness is the Key. Actually, I think Ego and Obstacle are almost exactly the same length. It's like 3 parts, 10 chapters in each part. So I'm not sitting there going like, what's this book? It's these small pieces of the book. So I'm sitting down, and my job is to write a 2,000 word chapter today, or half of a 2,000 word chapter today. So doing that, and then if you're doing it in these small pieces, like originally Ego is the Enemy was a book about humility, and it wasn't working as a book about humility. I couldn't even find what the chapters would be. Mm-hmm. So I was like, this is what I want. I wrote, I had a good sense of the intro, I had a good sense of the arc, a good sense of the argument. But it's like, okay, what are the 30 stories that I'm filling this book with? And I found 3, Yeah. And so breaking up in smaller pieces let me figure that out. And then it was like, oh, actually, this is a book against ego. And those stories filled up like that, right? Because those are some of the most famous stories in history, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think breaking your idea down to pieces and then looking at these smaller things lets you get a better sense of the whole than actually looking at the whole thing.
One thing I have to talk to writing students about is also be careful, because research can be very important, but it can also be enticing and prevent us from actually doing the work.
True.
And especially, I imagine someone like you formed a détente between writing and the research, but there are times where it's like, well, I'll go off and read some more and not actually do the work.
But that's also where the outlining and the sense of the whole fits in. I'm not just like walking around with a net trying to catch things. You know, that you do want to have a sense of what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I'm trying to find what goes here,
Right.
not trying to find things that could work generally.